Hello and welcome to the 3-year anniversary of the Hadean Press podcast. This month I am very happy to welcome Simone Kotva, a scholar and practitioner of mysticism and magic who has added a significant quantity of exceptional material to Hadean's ever-growing series of publications on the subject of the sorceress Saint Cyprian. Simone has 2 pamphlets available on the subject titled The Greek Prayer of Saint Cyprian, a Medieval Phylactery, and Cyprianic Conjurations from Norway. Her latest publication, Cyprianus, Saint Cyprian and the Black Book in Scandinavian Folklore, is a collection of translations focusing on recorded oral traditions of Cyprian, the Black School, the Devil, and of course, the Book of Cyprian. This collection of myths represents a living record of the local beliefs, superstitions, and above all, practical advice on how to negotiate an encounter with the spirits of this most powerful book of magic. If you enjoy this sort of conversation on the arts of the occult and esoteric, then please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We are always very grateful for every little thing that you can do to help us grow and reach a wider audience. I am your host, Matt Hadfield, and I am honoured to present Simone Kotva to the Hadean Press podcast. Simone, welcome to the podcast. For our listeners who might not be familiar with you, could you give us an introduction to yourself and your work?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm Simone Kotva and I am an academic. For about over a decade, I've worked in theology and I'm a scholar practitioner of Western Christian mysticism and what I like to call techniques of ecstasy. And I also work on folklore, what I sometimes called folklore theology. What I'm primarily interested in are the techniques of not just ecstasy, but spirit communication, all the kind of practices and methods by which we communicate with spirits and make things happen in the world.
And so what was it that sparked your initial interest in magic? And what can you tell us about your first experiences?
So I think that I began my interest in magic very early. It's probably a common answer from your guests. So a member of my family was trained in a form of spirit flight. And so I was taught some of those techniques, sadly not very well, I have to say, when I was little. But I was always aware that these things were real and things happened, all the kind of run-of-the-mill paranormal stuff that I just think are part of life, I guess. Those things happened, and I only began training formally probably about 7 years ago with teachers and so on. And before then, I sort of explored a few different things. I think as a child, the practice I was mostly proficient at was actually palm reading of all things. I used to do that for money, so I started out as a old-fashioned fortune teller. Yeah, but I've spent a lot of time in the interim doing philosophy, which is also a technique for rewiring your brain in specific ways, and I find that is quite useful also when doing magic.
So we are here today to discuss your latest work, Cyprianus, Saint Cyprian and the Black Book in Scandinavian Folklore. We talk quite a lot about Cyprian on this podcast, such as his importance to the Grimoire tradition, but we've never had the pleasure of discussing his influence on Northern European practices. You've also written 2 other pamphlets for Hadean titled Cyprianic Conjurations from Norway and another one titled The Greek Prayer of Saint Cyprian, a Medieval Phylactery. So Cyprian is clearly one of your primary focuses of study and translation. What was it specifically about Cyprian that led you to collect these folk stories and to write these texts?
So it was Saint Cyprian himself, in the sense that I was doing Jason Miller's Black School of Saint Cyprian. So recommendation to all listeners that it's a really good course. And I was in the initial stages of contacting Saint Cyprian and establishing some lines of communication. And when I was reading about Saint Cyprian and in sort of trance, learning about him, I became really curious about the book of Saint Cyprian, and the identity of the book, the nature of the book, and this idea that there was a true book. So I petitioned to be taught what the nature of the true book was, and to learn things that I couldn't access where I was at the moment with like the reading that I had and so on. And within a couple of weeks, I had been led to find a number of different pieces of research that I could see the connections between in a really fruitful way. And that led me to the three Cyprian translations, because they're all translations where I have edited and provided an introduction to provide the reader with useful and usable texts that they can make, that they can have practical results with in their personal practice. Yeah.
Hmm. So practicality and technique are primarily your focus and your interest. Why is it that you underscore that so much?
Because even though I am, or perhaps because I am trained as technically a philosophical theologian, which is what I do professionally, I think that because I'm trained in a discipline that is what people would call very speculative, right? I do metaphysics and ontology and so on. I see the danger in getting in going down the rabbit hole of these disciplines for the sake of nothing but speculating. And so for me, metaphysics is deeply meaningful when it is anchored in practice, when it is anchored in something that you can see the results of in the everyday, in the domestic, as well as in special extreme circumstances where you need to like protect yourself, or it's a miraculous cure that needs to be effected. Yeah, so that's why I emphasize the practical so much, because I actually come from a position of what other people would say would be like a purely abstract discipline or pure speculation. So for me, that's a way of also making sense of what I do and showing how and why it matters.
Let's start with the historical setting. How does Cyprian arrive in Scandinavia and the northern countries of Europe? And what form of sorcery was prevalent at the time?
Yeah, so there's sort of two waves of Cyprianic invasion, if you like. I mean, Cyprian first comes together with Justina with Christianization. So, I mean, as your listeners will know, Cyprian and Justina and Theokistos are part of the old canon of saints, and they come with Christianization. And Scandinavia is Christianized. I mean, it's a very big area geographically, but we start serious Christianization around the 11th century, really, although it's a bit earlier with the first saints and so on coming. So anyway, Christianization brings them. But the Cyprian that we're talking about, the sorcerous Cyprian, the Cyprian who is the author of these conjurations and speaks in the first person through them, doesn't come until after the Reformation or during the Reformation period. And so this is an early modern arrival. And the first rumor we have of Saint Cyprian arriving is solo. He does not arrive in the second coming of Saint Cyprian to Scandinavia with Saint Justina. This is a Cyprian who is no longer really seen as a saint, but as a bishop, because we're talking about Reformation Scandinavia. And he comes in the form of his famous exorcism prayer, which exists in many, many different forms. And the one that I have provided in the Hadean pamphlet, which is called the Greek Prayer of Saint Cyprian, is one of the earlier manuscripts of the Greek versions that we have that's been translated. And it's a version of this in Latin, and that we know came to Denmark in the 16th century because a fragment of it is preserved in the Royal Library there. And so in the 17th century, it was widely copied by hand into little books that were called Cyprianus, like the book itself would be called a Cyprianus, because this prayer, and anyone who's seen it in any of the translations from the Iberian Cyprianic literature will know that it's quite long. and kind of remarkably long, like several pages, right? Whereas all the spells in the folk magic is quite short by comparison in terms of like a spell would be like maybe a couple lines, and then you have this Cyprianic conjuration, which takes up the bulk in the way. And this was very much the case in Scandinavia. So he comes in this conjuration, and often that conjuration, where a Cyprian speaks in the first person, will be like the only part of a Swedish book of magic from that time, or Broados, Danish or Norwegian, which has anything to do with Saint Cyprian. And so these books were called Cyprianus books, and they were often contrasted with the more famous grimoires. And they would be contrasted by calling them the small magic book. There'd be like the big magic book, and then there'd be the small one. So the big one would be something like one of the Faust grimoires, or the sixth and seventh book of Moses, or one of the Keys of Solomon, right? That would be the big one. And then there would be the little one, and that would be the Cyprianus. And sometimes all it would contain would be the prayer, because it was seen as a kind of all-purpose Swiss Army knife formula that you could use and adapt in lots of different ways, and then supplemented with your local folk magic spells that you could have got from, your family, your lineage, but also the kind of spells that were coming up from the continent, because the prayer itself often didn't travel solo either, but came with a lot of the spells for invisibility and so on that we recognize from Southern Europe.
Mm. And would these little books, would they have been handwritten, or was there a tradition of the printing press producing any of these?
Yes, so they were manuscripts, handwritten. This is because the Reformation had quite an impact on Scandinavia, and there was strict censorship. And so there was no free press until the end of the 18th century. And so for much longer than we have seen the Catholic world on the continent, you just couldn't publish grimoires of any kind. And so what happened was that people copied them out, and the Cyprian books were copied by hand, and they were often very small. I mean, physically, they're not very large objects. I've seen there's one on display in the Historical Museum in Oslo, and I mean, it's the size of one of those tiny little notebooks, the ones that became fashionable, like little moleskins.
Yeah, in the book itself, you write one of the tales that you quote from
Yeah.
includes one of the characters in the story hiding the book or finding the book in their pocket where they usually keep it after they've
Yeah.
tried to dispose of it. And we'll come to how this works later on in the interview, but immediately you understand that the text itself isn't this big book that people are carrying around. It's something that is so small it could be secreted easily in a pocket.
Yeah, exactly. I find that a very important detail about the book that's often overlooked. It's also part of the characteristic of some of the Cyprianic books that you find on the continent. So when we read about the trial records of Iberian practitioners accused of being Cyprianic sorcerers, one of them has an account of a man carrying on his person a tiny book that was sort of like only the prayer of Saint Cyprian, again, just made into a little book. So like a pamphlet, right?
Yeah, so of course, this makes sense because, of course, if you were ever caught with something like this, it could be life or death.
I'm not sure it's life or death. However, it was very embarrassing, and you could face prosecution and a period in jail. But maybe I should talk a little bit about the relationship between using the Book of Saint Cyprian in early modern Scandinavia and doing witchcraft.
A fantastic distinction to make, yes.
Because I didn't actually answer one of your earlier questions, which was what was the indigenous form of magic practiced when Saint Cyprian arrives, right? So this will allow us to look at that. So the prayer of Saint Cyprian is obviously a Catholic prayer in the sense of, well, it could be Orthodox. It's a Christian prayer which promises the expelling of evil spirits from a person and their protection. And the Scandinavian adaptations that you can read about in the pamphlets, it's been adapted to all sorts of purposes, but it's mostly protective and so on, and it expels. So it's an exorcistic prayer, and this is how it was used in the Catholic context, in the Orthodox context. And when it comes to Sweden, it is in the Reformation period when the clergy are very wary of anything Catholic, right? And a new definition of witchcraft and sorcery was beginning to set in, whereby a lot of things which, from a contemporary scholarly perspective, is just, like popular prayers or etc., layperson's exorcism also, all of that was being classified as witchcraft and as illegal and illicit magic. Indeed, magic itself, in the Reformation context, the Lutheran context of Scandinavia, was not really seen in the more nuanced way that it was in the Catholic context, whereby you had a distinction between licit and illicit magic, right? Overwhelmingly, in the sort of popular Lutheran context, all magic was seen as illicit. This is not something you were supposed to do, which does shift the way in which witchcraft is portrayed. Because witchcraft, and here I'm using it as a translation of the Scandinavian trolldom, which means the realm of trolls, trolls being unruly spirits that could be the spirits of the dead and all sorts of other spirits, right? So someone who had pacts and means of accessing these spirits was a practitioner of trolldom, and this was seen as illicit magic. And what happens in the early modern period is that the Book of Saint Cyprian becomes called a book of trolldom, although, of course, anyone who reads the prayer will recognize that this is a sort of quote unquote pious prayer, right, that promises good things. But in order to get the good things it promises, you have to bind and name a lot of bad spirits in the sense of unruly spirits. And so there's one report that I find really fascinating from the early modern period in southern Sweden, where a man has been practicing healing and other forms of, just sort of folk magic for his local community for a number of decades. And a new pastor enters his local community, and he doesn't like the idea that this man is helping his fellow parishioners in the way that he is, because it smells like a Catholicism, which is magic, right? So he has him investigated and called up to the local court, and he has to hand over his book, because the rumor is that he does all of this from a book, a small book. He hands it over and they copy it out, so we know exactly what his book of magic looked like. And it's a prayer of Saint Cyprian, a long one, adapted, kind of personalized. But that's it. That is his grimoire. That's his book of black magic. It's the prayer of Saint Cyprian. And so he refuses to recant because he says, what I do is holy, etc., etc. And he also makes fun of the young priest because he himself is an elderly man. And he is, what is he? Yes, he has to be in jail for 2 weeks on bread and water, I think, or a couple of weeks on bread and water. Um, so this is related to the kind of more famous witchcraft persecutions and trials that we get in Scandinavia. But the Book of Saint Cyprian is sometimes called a book of witchcraft, and yet it has this relationship to piety that makes it somewhat immune to some of those accusations in a really interesting way. And I'll just round this off by saying that um, in Scandinavia at the time, you have this indigenous concept of trolldom, so having consort with trolls and so on. And this is something which you could attain by all sorts of means that weren't particularly technique heavy. Like all you needed to do was go out, sit on a mountain until the trolls came, right? And you had to just survive that encounter, which gave you mastery. Well, not really mastery in practice, it just gives you line of communications and pacts with these creatures, right? And if you were too afraid and overwhelmed, or you died or whatever, then obviously you didn't gain the wisdom or the access. So these were the age-old techniques that we hear about also from much older sources, pre-Christian sources, or at least, they're Christian, but talk about pre-Christian time, that was practiced all over the region. And so the Book of Saint Cyprian becomes amalgamated to that local conception. But there's an interesting distinction here, because it being a text/book of exorcism, it has quite an antagonistic relationship to the local spirits. It's a book of anti-magic in a way. I mean, it's magic that's anti-magic, right? And we know this is generally how exorcism tends to work. And it binds by like a higher power. It binds by the power of Christ and so on that comes in. And there's kind of a sort of colonial perspective, really, in a way, on how the Book of Saint Cyprian works. But so For that reason, because it's tied to a form of anti-magic, Lutheran priests were seen as people with a unique access to the spiritual authority that is represented by the prayer of Saint Cyprian. And there were legends, which I'm, going to talk about with the Danish folk tales that I've translated. But there were legends which were widely believed and traded that Lutheran priests, when they went for their training, or ordinands, and when they went for their training on the continent, because they often went to Germany, they came back with, arcane wisdom, right? And they were wearing black, and they had also received this book that they got from the Devil's School. And the Devil's School wasn't like a sort of baptism into Satanism, but it was through the authority of Jesus, they were able to outwit the devil and gain his wisdom, right? And so have power over the unruly spirits. And all of this was kind of represented by the prayer slash book of Saint Cyprian, which really were the same thing. And to the extent that any book, small book of magic, even though it didn't contain the prayer, would be called a Cyprianus. That was how strong the connection was.
It's really interesting. So I've had Carl Noblum on to the
Yes.
podcast, and we talked about his book on trolldom, and specifically, it's the title is Historiola. Historiola being a very common technique used
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the Scandinavian area. So this idea that the prayer of Cyprian, it might be quite long, but it's like overall it's a very short thing. Are we talking about the technique of historiola being applied to the prayer to Cyprian in this context? As maybe, despite it being quite long, you can select specific regions of it as active spell work.
Yeah, so let's talk more about the nature of it, right? What is the prayer of Saint Cyprian? And it is a long historiola. It could be characterized as such. It speaks in the conjurer speaks in the first person of Saint Cyprian, first talking about how he was a bad man and now he's a good man, right? And that gives him power in a nutshell. And then the length of the prayer in all its different forms comes from the fact that you are trying to make an exhaustive list of all the bad things that could happen to this person in the past or future. And by naming them, you're making it impossible for them to happen in the future, and you're taking away that power from the past. And the Greek prayer, which is the reason why I wanted to publish it, also has a named list of unruly spirits, which are actually really important for making this an effective spell, if you're doing it as an exorcism. We could talk more about kind of how to put these into practice and so on. But yeah, there is a historiola, but there are versions where the historiola, as you say, isn't really that present. And so it's more the kind of memory of Cyprian that then fuels the spell. So it might say like this is Cyprian's conjuration, and then the person copying it down was copying a version that didn't even contain the historiola, or what I suspect, because copying by hand, I mean, these were time-consuming, arduous things, especially if you didn't really write very much otherwise in your life, right? The pen and ink process. I suspect that the historiola might have been something people ad-libbed or, were taught orally and they didn't think it was worth spending time writing that down. Instead, they wanted to have the important bits, which is like all the stuff you have to remember to say in order for the spell to really work.
I suppose my next question really is about like literacy in the area at the time, because of course priests had to be literate. So
Yeah.
I assume that priests going to Germany were coming into contact with like Southern Europeans at the same time from, Spain and Portugal, who might have been bringing the Cyprianic tradition further north. And then they in turn transmit it into the Scandinavian countries. However, from the stories that you've collected, from the folk tales that you've collated into your book, these stories are happening predominantly to common people, common folk. I suppose a lot of the times it's women reading from the book, and it often says in the myth as well that they don't understand what they're reading, but they
Mm.
they they can read nonetheless. So is it that the common folk were literate enough to have written and read these small Cyprianus texts by themselves, or was this something that was predominantly uh, in the wheelhouse of priests, and their closest, the people close to them?
Well, priests are suspects in this because they're so very literate, right, compared to your average parishioner. But literacy rates did rise remarkably with the Lutheran Reformation. One of the great programs of the reformers was to make sure that, people could read because priests wanted parishioners to be able to take part of the word of God, right? So it was important that the word was actually understood. And the word becomes central in a way to Lutheran Scandinavia that it hadn't been in Catholic Scandinavia. The written word was really important because you had basically said that this was where the event takes place in the reading of the word. There was also the Eucharist, but the word becomes really central, sort of spiritually. And you can see this in the way Protestant magic tends to put more emphasis on like writing and psalms and pages, right? Rather than say herbs and oils and so on. So it's a different type of material that comes into focus. And you can do lots of folk magic with literally like letters and writing on pieces of paper of the Bible and so on. Anyway, but yeah, so priests were suspects, and that's why the legends of the so-called Black Book priest or the Black Book minister thrived in Lutheran Scandinavia. But literacy rates were rising, and that is part of the story of, how these things could be traded. But we do think that, and we don't necessarily know who owned all of these manuscripts we have, because in the end of the 18th century, they did start to produce published versions, like printed versions, which were based on some of the manuscripts with a lot of license. The editors were quite loose and free with how they treated the texts. But it was certainly something that was more accessible than had been in previous centuries. So the Reformation brings with it increased literacy and so on.
Mm. Yeah, it's a dangerous thing teaching people to read, because then immediately they start reading about magic and start, using spells and things, and then it becomes a like a whack-a-mole, I suppose, for the church to try and keep order around the place. So a double-edged sword for the Lutherans there, I think. Um,
Yeah,
so
certainly.
your book then, is predominantly focused on the folkloric aspects of
Yes.
Cyprian, as we've mentioned, and you present a large collection of Danish legends assembled by one, and forgive me if I'm not pronouncing this very well, but Ival Tang Christensen.
Yes.
And can you tell us a little about Christensen and how their original collection was received? I mean, this was written, their text was written, what, a century, 2 centuries ago?
Yeah, so this is the end of the 19th century. Yeah, yeah. And Christensen is a really interesting figure. I'm also mispronouncing it because I'm not Danish. We have a different pronunciation of the names. But as you perhaps know, what's now Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish are really, I mean, as much as we would like to separate ourselves, as sort of the same language, different dialects. Yeah, so Christensen is a really fascinating figure, and I think one of the great folklorists actually of Northern Europe. He was a school teacher and he spent his spare time wandering about the countryside, collecting stories. And he was quite meticulous in this. He would note down, who was telling the story and so on. And he was not one of these armchair folklorists, because there were a lot of armchair folklorists at the time who would do things like, this was very common in his equivalents in Norway was a man called Bang, who would be more of an academic, sort of sitting in his office, having people send him things, and a lot of it then became very manuscript focused. Whereas Christensen walked around, talked to people, collected oral legends, and it wasn't just stories about the Black Book of Saint Cyprian. It was, I mean, he has it's an extraordinarily large collection of songs, games, everything that was just local culture. Because at the time, this was part of a kind of movement that is connected to national romanticism, of course, as well, where people were becoming interested in what was disappearing from their own national culture. And this whole idea that there was such a thing as a national culture is obviously also a result of that. Right? There was this interest in wanting to find sort of the original folk practices. But what I like about Christensen was that, unlike some of his contemporaries, perhaps because he wasn't such of a scholar about this, he wasn't obsessed with theories about trying to find in folk magic remnants of pagan religion, which I think has been a bit of a distraction to some of the scholarship. Not the contemporary scholarship. We've gone beyond that, but um, yeah, during his time, there were a lot of people who were mining this material for that kind of residue, and as a result, producing kind of average folklore. Whereas he just goes out there, documents what he finds, and produces material that can still be very useful today.
Mm. I don't know if you're familiar with Lafcadio Hearn. He was a very similar folklorist in Japan, and he did pretty much the same thing. He went
Yeah.
out, collected ghost stories and all sorts of like folk legends and tales of magic and sorcery. And yeah, I adore reading his work. So
Yeah.
I'm curious to research this Christensen a bit more myself, actually, and learn and read directly from the source, because this is yeah, this is really interesting stuff. So the threads of connection that you've put together through this in this text of specifically with the Scandinavian Cyprianus, um, to what degree do they share any sinews or material with the Iberian counterpart? Is there any direct link? I mean, we've already mentioned like Justina isn't as predominant or even focused on at all. But yeah, what threads of connection are there from the Portugal, Spain, that area that survive all the way up into the northern countries?
There is one really important thread, which is the text itself. That you have this continuous survival, use, reproduction, reinvention of a single spell is kind of remarkable across all of Europe. But it also, I mean, the prayer of Saint Cyprian was used. We have copies of it in um, various Northern African languages, and I mean, there's an Arabic prayer, many different versions, and it's used in the um, Eastern Orthodox churches and so on. So it's like it's just incredible to me that that has made its way up to Scandinavia. Now, that being said, the persona of Cyprian does change quite dramatically in some sense, because he's no longer a saint, really. He's just a bishop,
Mm-hmm.
if he's even named as such, because the legends that Christensen picks up, they are infused, and this is late 19th century, by the printed versions of the Cyprianus books. And some of them include these really like fantastic sensationalized stories of a female called Cyprianus, who is uh, sort of raped and imprisoned, or attempted rape and imprisonment by some monks, lascivious monks, and then she manages to escape and kind of outwits her male violators, right?
She writes in her own blood, right? The
Exactly.
Cyprianus. Yeah, it's a fantastic version of the story.
Yeah, and I mean, you could see all sorts of like, is that sort of Justina, somehow? I don't really think so. I think it's a way of, I think that's, that's rhetoric and sensationalizing. But the important thing there is that whether or not it's true, it really it helps fuel the historiola, and you're like, what is this material, and how does it gain its power? Because it was evidently very effective. Otherwise, people wouldn't have kept using it. And I mean, it is an effective spell. But so the other thing that does carry on from the Iberian tradition, apart from the fact that we have, variations of, but it's the same one, that the Cyprianic conjuration or the prayer of Saint Cyprian. We also have some of the folk magic spells, the spells of invisibility and so on, are obviously Iberian in origin and belong to a much older tradition. And other people have written research on, these black cat spells and like.
I was just about to say this is the black cat spells that we find in the Grimorium Verum.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
part of a general um, folk magic tradition.
Hmm. So the beans become the peas that are mentioned later on in the
Yeah.
stories that you've collected. I didn't put those two together. That's really interesting.
Yeah, so there are something, and I mean, you mentioned that was it the case that Lutheran ordinands in Germany were meeting sort of Spanish? I'm not quite sure that was the connection, but it was the text itself being translated and traded, right?
Yeah.
It's more sort of texts traveling necessarily than people and practitioners, which you might argue is sort of the same thing. But yeah, I that's my that's my suspicion anyway.
Mm. So yeah, so you quote Jose Leto in the introduction to your
Yes.
book, describing two versions of the Book of Cyprian. What are the natures of these two versions of the book, and what does Jose mean when he states that the folkloric book is immaterial?
Yeah, I love this distinction between the material and the immaterial book. So I make use of it when understanding what we're facing when we have these legends of the Book of Saint Cyprian, because these legends are sometimes obviously nothing to do with the real thing. So we talked about this, a small little book that you could put in your pocket. Now, some of the descriptions, they sound more like descriptions of the sixth and seventh books of Moses, or a classic conjuration grimoire like the Faust Grimoire with the spirit seals and so on. So clearly, and a lot of the descriptions also of the book, which we can get into this, like how the spirits are conjured and when the devil is accidentally conjured, and Mephistopheles like figure appears and so on, it described in ways that are obviously taken from the Faust tradition. Um, but nonetheless, there is this way in which these stories talk about how a person was like approaching the book, like what the book, how it gains its juice, right? Like, why is this a powerful book? So Leitau's understanding, as I see it, is that we need to distinguish between the thing you might see in a museum when you go to Oslo and you can see what would have been called a Cyprianus at the time, like a little book of recipes, right? Um, and then the stories that people would have told about a practitioner who had that book and did magic with it, right? That those two are distinct and they shouldn't be conflated into one. And the reason why I like this distinction is because scholars sometimes have wanted to say, because when you go to the museum, you can see it, there's nothing special about it. Therefore, the legends are not important, and are immaterial in the sense that they're irrelevant. And I don't think that's true at all, because what you find in the so-called immaterial Book of Saint Cyprian, if you like, is sometimes folklore practices for how to pact with a spirit, right? And yes, they don't necessarily have anything to do with like the physical object, but they have things to do with how you can become a powerful practitioner and user of the book, and in general, how you gain spiritual authority, which is one of the big things in these legends. They're concerned with how does a person become, for want of a better word, magical? Like, how do you become a practitioner? Where do you begin? Where is your quote unquote initiation? And that's tied to the book because the thing about the book is that it is an aggressively animistic object, right? It's alive for these people, and as you say, you can conjure the devil by accident. Maids reading the book, not realizing what it is when their master is out giving a sermon, right? And he rushes home because this is the Lutheran priest who's the master. So the book itself is alive and it's animated. And so the question is, how do I read this book safely? How do I have spiritual authority enough that when I open the book, it doesn't take control over me, right? That's what people wanted. So these legends, they give us insights into some of the practices, because some of them I think are real and you could replicate them. Others are more fanciful, right? And some are a mixture of the two. But that's why they're really important. The immaterial book is really important because it talks about those aspects, not just the experiences of the book, which is another thing that they often talk about, like how was it to hold it, what was your experience? But this question of spiritual authority and how do I become someone who isn't overpowered by the book, but empowered by it. And so I can do amazing things, right?
And I also love the idea of this the immaterial side of it being like transmitted orally through legend and myth between various people, as it is alive in its telling. right? It evolves and grows and changes in its telling as well. Whereas a physical book is like it's trapped in amber and it's frozen. And once its owner passes away, then it sort of remains in that state. Whereas a living tradition, oral tradition, continues to adapt and evolve. And I think that, like you said, that I love that phrase that you used, aggressively animistic. It's powerfully alive in the way that it wants to find avenues to manifest, and then that's why people keep rewriting it and recreating the object over and over again, because it possesses that desire to manifest in a sense.
Yeah. And I think it did so because of these practices that were surrounding it. And if you had successfully conjured by it, that, it made the book alive. And so in that sense, it's a liber spiritum. But I don't think necessarily every Cyprianus was like that. But there were Cyprianus books that certainly had that attraction.
Mm. Before we hit the record button, we mentioned a little bit about pre-Christian ideas, and
Yeah.
just prior, we talked about the idea of pacting, and you mentioned something to me which I wasn't aware of, which was that those who would work with Odin would pact.
Yes.
How do you think the Cyprianus then adapts into Scandinavian culture in that regard?
Yeah, so the Cyprianus arrives in a Scandinavia that has its own ecology of spirits and its own understanding of who to whom you go when you need to do the dirty work at the crossroads, right? So, and this would be Odin or the devil, and these two figures are sometimes conflated. At least they have similar characteristics and features. And there's a whole literature and a scholarly discussion about what happens here is syncretism and also kind of demonization in a way of Odin. But there is a folkloric Odin in southern Scandinavia who is distinct from the Odin that you might know from like watching whatever they are, the blockbuster films where you have Odin. And this is a crossroads spirit with whom you pact in ways that are cognate with what we find all over European folklore, going to the crossroads and also in of course North and South America. It's the same type of practices, and the figure that you meet is also cognate. Now, specifically in southern Scandinavia, it's associated with Odin, who is a tall man dressed in black with a broad-brimmed hat, often carrying a spear, often riding a horse, but not always, accompanied by dogs, but not always, wandering at night. And you can pact with him in various different ways. One of them is by going to a crossroads. And so what you get are documents that accuse people of having pacted with the devil, and then others that accuse people of having pacted with Odin, and then sort of equating the two, talking about Odin as the evil one and so on, because he's associated with these liminal periods that are scary, right? Like being out in the dark in the countryside is probably not a comforting experience, right? So yeah, that's a really important background to the Cyprianus, because some of the practices that we see in the legends around the Cyprianus book are obviously from uh, that storehouse of practices and thought worlds, right? And so, in order to empower yourself so that you can have mastery over the book, there are also crossroads practices that are mentioned in some of the legends. And so that comes from that tradition. And so then the question is like, is Cyprian really Odin or something like that? Which I don't really think, but I do see in the material that the Imaginarium was such that um, people would associate the origin of any kind of sorcerous power over unruly spirits with that dark person, as in dressed in black at the crossroads, who wanders through the countryside at night and so on.
Yeah, it's very evocative of the devil to begin with in Christian thought and imagination.
I wouldn't, this is the interesting thing. It's not really evocative of like strictly speaking, the biblical devil, but it is evocative of uh, the idea of a psychopomp spirit because he's also Odin is also master of the dead. And so that's the funny thing about the devil in Scandinavia, is that on the one hand you have this obviously Odinic figure who is sometimes called the devil. And then you also have a more kind of cartoon, cut out, sort of biblical devil type figure, um, which is more associated with, I say biblical, actually, that's not entirely correct, but sort of folk Christian notion of the devil,
Mm.
with horns and sort of monstrous looking, right?
So yeah, we've talked a lot about like the way in which the book is animated and ensouled. Um, so could you describe something about the the behaviors of the book? What does the book do in these folk tales?
Well, if you're not cunning enough, it overpowers you, right? That's the main thing. So, the book doesn't want to be destroyed. That's a really common theme. It doesn't want to be destroyed. And if you try and destroy it, then it will sort of rematerialize and so on. And it's very difficult to get rid of a Cyprianus. That's perhaps one of the most famous. I mean, I remember that being one of the things I knew about the Cyprianus as a kid, because if you talk to my grandparents' generations, if you said Cyprianus to them, they knew it was witchcraft. That was how, like, the association in the mind. So yeah, this is a book you do not want to have if you don't know how to use it, or if you're not planning to use it. You can't get rid of it. It'll reappear and make your life hell, basically. That's the idea. So you could map that onto, the idea that unless you practice these things, if you have the inclination, it will come to haunt you or something like that. I guess you could do a sort of Jungian interpretation, which I don't know, I'm not all that fond of, but there are those parallels. But yeah, that's one of the main things, is that the book has its own agenda. It wants something. And of course, what it wants you to do is to conjure the spirits that are kind of bound by the book, and that you can access by reading from the book. So, one thing that we were talking about before recording was this idea that you find in the Scandinavian tradition of reading and then reading back. So, by saying the words, you are, whether or not you're intending to, actually conjuring. And then what do you do if you don't want to have that spirit present anymore, right? You have to read back. And this is often mentioned, this idea that in order to resolve a situation where someone has accidentally conjured from a Cyprianus, you need to read back. And I've often retained that in the translation, even though it's awkward in English, making a note, explaining it to the reader, just because it does represent a specific type of practice where you are sort of using words to, in the same way that words release the spirit, you can contain them again by reading back. And that's a really interesting practice, which gives you an insight onto folk magic in this period.
What strikes me though, I think, is the idea that it's so accidental how these spirits are untapped, or released
Yeah.
from the book. Whereas a lot of like British or other European medieval grimoires are like, oh no, you have to have this circle in this exact correct way, and you need all these very specific tools, and it has to be done at this very specific astrological moment, and all of these rules and all of these props that must be completed first before contact can be made with the spirit.
Yeah.
Whereas this version, this Cyprianus, is like if you open it wrong, it will explode with spirits. It's like, if you look at it in the wrong way, and a lot of the stories are people just picking it up or just opening it and then having to deal with these consequences. And so it's quite a contrast, I think, of the way in which spirits inhabit this text.
Yeah, and I'd like to think about that a bit more, because what strikes me is that there's a parallel here between, something that I think everyone can recognize from practice, is that it is kind of accidental when you're not doing it in a way where you're controlling the spirit. So the types of narratives that appear in these legends are of two kinds. One is the person who has spiritual authority over the book and uses it, the results they get are the results they want. And then the person who does not have spiritual authority and they use it and the results they get are not the results they want. I mean, they may not have wanted any results except oh, I know this is a book of magic and my master's out. I mean, that's the story, right? The maid picks it up. Sometimes there's that. Sometimes they don't know what they're picking up, but often it's like, oh, that book, that it's attracting me. The book can sometimes call to you and force you to read, which I quite like this idea.
Turn the
The
page,
book that
right?
yes, you can't stop reading. um, but yeah, and so I think that there's not a contradiction here. Because sometimes these legends of like reading the book and accidentally conjuring can be seen as very fanciful, as if like, oh, this is clearly nothing to do with how ritual magic was actually done and how Solomonic techniques are practiced. Because don't you know that you need to have all these timings? I think the difference here is about accidental versus intentional use, because that's something we see still. Like you can have kind of accidental results using the tech from grimoire practice. Uh, that's something I think most of us have experienced, right? And especially with books that have been empowered and enlivened, you shouldn't be giving them to anyone because accidental things can happen. We know this, right? Liber Spiritums are actually, what they say on the tin if they've been done properly. So I think it's reflecting that, and then you have the intentional use, which is also represented in the legends. Like someone who knows can use the book and the thing they want happens, right? So I find that very interesting because the sort of accidental use nowadays, we only find that in rhetoric, coming from a certain type of polemic against magic from a certain type of evangelical religious background where it's like, I read this thing and suddenly all the demons appeared and so on, right? And so part of this is always going to be exaggerated and fanciful, but there is a basic, I think, very practical distinction there between accidental and intentional usage.
Mm. And I would add, as an animist, as somebody who sees the cosmos itself as alive with multiple intelligences, that I think a lot of people are um, they're adding that limitation themselves because they think that they have to do X, Y, and Z perfectly correctly according to the manual. Whereas in the instance of, say, like harvesting a hazel wand, like the idea of going to the tree and approaching the tree, communicating with the tree, entering into dialogue with the tree, harvesting the branch, etc., at the right time, all of those things possess spirit in the moment as you're working with it. So you're not divorced from nature at any point in the process. You're intimately, interdependent with all of it throughout the whole thing. So approaching with a magical mindset or an animistic mindset from the very beginning, yes, I can totally understand why a book like this could be seen as so simple to conjure from. And yes, to your point as well, like the idea of having intent in the sense of knowing what you're doing and having been initiated or having created a pact first, compared to having not done those things. And then the fallout, I suppose, if, the results, the negative results that come from that. I'd love to dispel that myth of the idea that um, the cosmos and nature itself isn't already magical before you even begin.
There's certainly a lot of consciousness, and that's for sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what's often missed is, you know, a properly made Book of Spirits is going to be, animated, even though the material itself is already animated. But for practical purposes, it's going to be powerful, right? And I think we sometimes underestimate like how serious our ancestors were about magic as well. I mean, there was so much more at stake. Like their lives were a lot harder than ours are. They would put in a lot more effort and yeah, high stakes kind of intention into what they were doing, and so they got better results because of that. I actually think some of these legends are not exaggerations. I mean, some of them clearly are, right? And we can talk about the black poodle, but it's I just think sometimes with the stakes, especially I say this from northern Scandinavia, sorry, not northern Europe, where actually, because in northern Scandinavia, life is still quite tough. But in general, we have it really well in Scandinavia, welfare system and so on. And I think that our way of understanding these texts is poorer for that reason.
Mm. Let's talk a bit more about like the way in which the book itself is animated. And we've mentioned that you can't get rid of it, and a lot of the stories talk about burning it, throwing it in an oven when baking bread, or throwing it into a lake with a rock chained to it or something like that, and then immediately getting home and finding the book on your table again. I love how visual that is. You can also almost imagine it being in a horror movie, and I can see why these stories are really popular in the day. There's also this idea that you have to outsmart the spirit that comes from it. And so when we go back to the Black School, we see one of the stories, one of the legends that is attached to that is that the last priest to leave the school is taken by the devil, and
Yes.
so they have to all the priests work together and to save each other essentially. So there is no last priest to leave, or that they somehow outsmart the devil in some way. Could you talk a little bit about some of these techniques of um, outsmarting the devil, or keeping the devil busy so that he can't? What would be the best way of saying it? Like you said before, the idea that if you weren't initiated properly, you would be forsaken. I don't know exactly what the right word would be, but what was the consequence?
Yeah, so it can be that you are, you know, basically consumed by these spirits. Yeah, you would fear for your sanity and physical integrity of your body, right? So it
Mm.
was life and death matters. But also, and this is something which is mentioned in one of the legends, the fear that you are unleashing a whole legion of unruly spirits on your parish, right? It was this kind of community think that like the priest was sort of the protector of a parish, like a whole community. And so in one of the legends, it says something like if he hadn't come in time, the leader of the trolls, which is how, I mean, that's the devil or the evil one, right? Would have run rampant around the whole parish. Right? So that's one of the things that they fear. But yeah, death and insanity
I see.
is and
Okay.
and general sort of being plagued by the inability to have any luck, just
Mm,
misfortune, and so
mm.
on. Yeah.
So those are the risks. We've talked about how it's very difficult to be destroyed, and how it always finds a way of reappearing. What was some of the techniques though that we could use to outsmart the devil?
So they are the classic techniques of all folk magical stories of what do you do to keep a spirit occupied, right? So that you have time to run away from it is one thing, you give it things to count and so on. But the main one is to give it an impossible task. And this is why a lot of them are humorous. Sort of if you let a fart escape and you say, can you put that back where it came from? And you brought up the one with the pubic hair and sort of can you make this straight and so on. So you can give the spirit an impossible task. And this comes back to some very basic ways of trapping spirits, right? That you are creating um, in their own mind palace, as it were, right? You're setting something up that they can't escape from. And you have to do that authoritatively, otherwise it won't work, obviously. And so those are the types of legends that you see there. And the kind of historiola that sometimes it's not really an historiola, but the stories that you see in the legends about how the spirits act when they're accidentally conjured or sort of intentionally conjured. They are very reminiscent of the preface or the framing narrative of some of the Faust books, where Mephistopheles comes, right? If you remember, I don't know if your readers of listeners are familiar with that framing narrative,
Yes,
but
yes, they would be. Yes.
yeah, yeah. And it's very clear that a lot of these legends are about a sort of they've somehow picked up on bits of the Faust literature, of the Faust grimoires, that someone's read the preface and so on, and that's very clear in how the spirits appear and what they do and so on. But yeah, it's about outsmarting, but giving them this impossible task,
Mm,
um, and which also reflects, the practices of being very specific about your requests and making sure that you don't give the spirit a loophole. So it all goes back to very standard spirit pacting
Mm,
practices, I think. And of course they're then made into humorous stories and so on, right? Because the person who is the most clever isn't always the most book-wise, right? It's the one who knows how to come up on the spot with the best kind of tasks.
mm. I liked the one where he's the devil is tasked to um was it that he has to sieve through a an entire lake, but he can't
Yeah.
pick up the sieve because the sieve is made up of crosses. So
Yes.
he's immediately put in a bind because he can't do anything about it. He can't pick up the sieve, and he can't complete his task. I really like that. How about the sleeping magic with the 3 Thursdays? Is Odin in any way related to the day of Thursday?
Yes, he is. It's the day of well, the day that you should be doing magic on in Scandinavia is Thursday or Sunday. There are sort
Okay,
of
that
two
makes sense
two
then.
Sabbaths. Thursday, even though it's Thor's day, I mean, it's not Wednesday, which is Odin's day. Thursday is the day of power, and we don't exactly know why that is, but it's very widespread. It's also not specific to Scandinavia. You have that in a lot of different cultures of Thursday being particularly powerful, right? And it becomes connected to Maundy Thursday as well, which has just been when we still have a practice of dressing up and mummery and things like that, mumming. But yeah, so it is connected to Odin, but it's also connected to generally like a day of power, either the Thursday or the Sunday. The Sunday being, the Lord's Day and all the folk magic to do with that. Yeah.
So many of my listeners will know that I am particularly interested in grimoires which have a pact making aspect.
Yes.
Um, so do Scandinavian books of Cyprian necessitate the process of pacting? And how does it differ from, say, like the French diabolic styles, say, found in the Grimoire Verum or the Grand Grimoire?
So the strictly speaking, the Cyprianus is distinguished by having a version of the prayer of Saint Cyprian. This is how I would define it. And I would encourage other scholars to do the same because otherwise it becomes very confusing. There is a tendency to say that a Cyprianus is simply any book of magic in Scandinavia because it was often used that way. We talked about this. You could say Cyprianus and it just means grimoire, right? But if we want to have any kind of definition that we can work with, should say that it should contain a prayer of Saint Cyprian in some version, or show the clear residue of a prayer of Saint Cyprian. Now, the prayer of Saint Cyprian is not a pacting spell. It's protective anti-magic. It's used in the Catholic context as a prayer for lay exorcism, right? Um, you're simply binding lots of spirits there in the Greek version, which is why that's the one I recommend mostly if you want to use it as an exorcism. You have specific spirits that are named, and this also helps the process and makes it much more effective. Um,
So are the names in this prayer, are they in any way like similar to, say, the Astrakios prayer?
yes, there are a string of names. So there are three sets of names in the Greek prayer of Saint Cyprian, which you say at various times. You're just binding and throwing out, casting out various unruly spirits. And there are three sets of them, and they are just the types of names you would find in any prayer of success type. Uh, like a string of spirit names.
String of spirit names, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and they give they give a lot more to the operation. The equivalent of that in the Scandinavian context is you're naming spirit types,
Ah.
right? So groups of spirits, a bit like you would say, and I throw away the fairies and the trolls and so on, right? I mean, you have a string of spirit types, but not specifically the names themselves. So yeah, but so this being said, the spells that are sometimes included in a Cyprianus can be pacting spells, right? Where you're making a pact. And so they are folkloric grimoire workings and operations where you like go to a crossroads and make a pact, or where it's, you conjure up a specific spirit and make a pact. So yeah, that absolutely exists in the type of spell that you would find together with a prayer of Saint Cyprian in the same type of book. That does exist as well. Um, But the prayer of Saint Cyprian itself is not a pacting operation, and it calls. I mean, I'm really interested in it as a practice, or sort of as a piece of practical magic, and what you can do to make it more powerful, and what people do, and so on. And there are various framing, I call them sort of framing rites for it. Historically, the most important one was seems to have been the Gospel of John, actually, the beginning of the Gospel of John. So reading from that first, and then doing the thing. And I mean, this can be either made as originally it was always a phylactery, so it was always like a written thing rolled up into a scroll or whatever, or folded or something, and worn. But it also was used as an exorcism, as a healing treatment, basically, with various materia we know of, like oil and rosemary and other things like that used with it.
Mm.
But yeah, the Gospel of John, so a little bit of Bible reading as a framing rite. Um, but I've also used it together with material from the Coptic magical papyri,
Oh,
uh,
wonderful.
where we also find, of course, the earliest extant Cyprianic conjuration, which is a love spell,
Ah, well, that
which
makes sense. Yeah.
which is thought to bear, which by scholars today is thought to bear a historical relationship to our uh, prayer of Saint Cyprian. And what's interesting there is that in the Coptic one, which I recommend, if you're interested, you should definitely check out both the prayer of Saint Cyprian and the Coptic love spell, because that is a much more aggressive working. Um, but you should look at sort of the broader literature of spells around that, because, for instance, the prayer of power of Mary is can be used as a framing rite together with the Cyprianic conjurations
Mm.
and so on. So there's a lot you can do with them. Yeah.
Wonderful. So we've mentioned animals a couple of times already, but
Oh yeah.
I really enjoyed the section of your introduction where you described the various animals associated with both cunning folk and the devil. And later you give a great many examples of such animals being conjured by accident, um, simply by having read the book. There's birds and I think flies, insects, cats, dogs, all sorts of animals which are brought to the immediate vicinity of the person who's reading them, reading from the book. Um, I'm always interested in learning about the rationale for all the sympathies and relationships which are connected from the magic to the animals in these situations. So of all the animals in the folklore of the Cyprianus, which animals stand out the most, and why do you think that they have such a sinister attribution?
Well, that's a good question. Which ones stand out the most? I guess I actually haven't looked at the statistics. I think of the dog, but also possibly the birds, probably because they often appear in like a flock. So I guess statistically they're the most common. Um, they have most of the animals that appear have sinister um, connotations in Scandinavian folklore because they are traditionally associated with the practice of magic in some form, and especially Odin. So the Cyprianus material and the legends talk about corvids appearing, and all the corvids are sort of sacred to Odin in Scandinavian folklore. And so that's a clear sort of connection. I feel like a lot of the animals are very rooted in the types of things you would expect to see in Scandinavia at this time if you saw something sinister. See what I mean? And so they're also like the animals that are associated with witchcraft and animals that witches might turn into, right?
Cats and
Um,
owls and
yeah,
pigs and horses. Yeah, yeah.
exactly. And I mean, a lot of these are just pan-European, right? Witchcraft animals.
Mm.
Yeah.
And earlier too, we mentioned there's one example where a bull shows up, but then is sent away and returns as a soldier. And as I
Yeah.
said, it's very evocative of the idea of like Solomonic conjuring, where a furious spirit arrives within the triangle in the mirror, and then the sorcerer commands them to take on a more appeasing or a more appealing form through which they can communicate. Do you think there's some kind of connection or bleed through there in this form of magic?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, so some of the legends are about the Cyprianus in the sense of the prayer that we're talking about, but a lot of them are also about just people doing regular Solomonic magic. They're mostly working from the Faust grimoires, is my impression from just the legends and so on, and also what we know about, well, the sixth and seventh book of Moses. I mean, they're overlapping, right? Yeah, so I think a lot of people were doing that sort of stuff and had stories about it, and also would be reading, at least in the grimoires, that this is what it's supposed to be like. So even if they perhaps were not true stories, they're a memory of that literature being very important in the imagination. Yeah, but I actually my favorite one is just a wheel of fire or something. There's another one. There's lots of animals and then just this random wheel of fire.
Well,
Which
that's isn't that from Ezekiel?
Yeah, I mean it's typically how angels appear. Yeah. So
Yeah, yeah. So I can see how a literate Christian have might conjure that sort of symbolic, I say, quote unquote, creature.
yeah, something fearsome anyway appeared.
Yeah. But yeah, thank you for that. I love listening to people's ideas about how animals sort of show up throughout the Grimoire corpus, because there's always so many different connections that we can hunt through, we can search for. I don't know if you've read Al Cummings and Brian Johnson's Faustian Grimoire on
Yes.
yeah, the Black Raven, right? And there's
Yeah.
this again the that bird shows up just about everywhere. So it has a lot of intimate connections with these spirits. So it's always interesting
Yeah.
to hear about how different cultures adapt to it and process it and sort of like create their own rationales for these expressions, animalistic expressions. And for me personally, it's always about how humans are in dialogue with nature, and
Mm.
it's the way in which we are communicating with these. I say communicating, sharing our habitations with these other beings. In a similar way to how we would do it with spirits, and how the spirits sort of communicate through them.
Yeah, and that's something which the rural setting for a lot of these stories, it's worth thinking about what that meant. So I think that a lot of the time when a spirit was accidentally conjured or, these type, you were surrounded by all these domestic animals, really. Like it would be a farm or whatever. And it's quite likely, I think, that you would see some of them behaving oddly because animals do tend to pick these things up. And so some of the stories, I mean, and this is not trying to give a naturalistic explanation, but I mean, animals are often sensitive to paranormal things, right? And if you're on a farm, you have lots of animals or many more animals than you would have like today in a flat in an urban area in the equivalent part of the world, right? And so I suspect that's why animals behaved oddly, and that was something you were more attentive to. I mean, there were just more animals around to behave oddly, right?
Well, yeah, it's
Um,
raining cats and dogs, the expression, right? Because it
yeah.
literally was raining cats and dogs at some points because there were that many of them. Yeah, so I think my favorite one of the animal stories that you collected here is the one with the mirror that gets broken with the flies, and there's sort of like a race to reread or go back over the material. But I like that idea of having to race against a natural phenomena in the moment
Yeah.
to complete dissipate the spell, as it were, to dissipate the spirits. So yeah, finally, perhaps my favorite of these collected legends is that the original Cyprianus, the first Cyprianus text, was written by seven condemned witches who each wrote a chapter of the book on the night before being executed.
Mm.
And I just adore the plurality of these mythic access points that you highlight throughout the book. And in your opinion, how can we implement this folklore into the way in which that we engage with this form of sorcery?
Great question. Come to the practical question, right? Because I hope, as I was saying earlier, that you engage with these books in order to experiment. Please do, and please let me know what your results are. Um, so the legends that we have can show us ways of accessing the book with spiritual authority, right? Now, I wouldn't say that like all the legends are equally useful in this way. Some might inspire dreams or whatever it is, like in your personal practice, and it's just worth like divining on all of them when you're engaging with this sort of material. Um, but a lot of the legends are actually really practical. Like some of them give advice on how to basically initiate yourself into the book by sleeping with it for consecutive Thursdays, right? Which is a really simple thing to do. I mean, some of these things are fanciful, and some of them are legends that you wonder, like, what's the meaning of this? You know, incorporate it into your dream practice and see what comes of it, and then do the practical things that it suggests you doing and see what result that has, right? And it may have no results, and it may have spectacular results, right? So I think that's what I get out of these legends. If you approach them pragmatically, experimentally, with a kind of a good system for testing the results you get, then it can really take some of these things to the next level. Because they can sometimes feel a bit stale. I want to say some of these conjurations, because a lot of them haven't really been used for a long time, and so activating them is sometimes half the work, actually, and it's often the thing that's missing. Because what do I just pick the pamphlet I have on the Scandinavian conjurations? I mean, pick it up and say it. Obviously, that's not the whole story, and so I do give instructions on how to best, in my opinion, just get a simple, straightforward result. And that's why I also wanted the Greek prayer to be in there, because it's a bit fuller and closer to a time when these things were done professionally. Um, yeah, I think that's what I get from the immaterial book, as Leitao would put it, right? That it gives us these keys for activating the material book, and those keys are often missing. Yeah.
What do you think then about adapting the prayer for Saint Cyprian? So you mentioned before that one of the extant versions that we have access to now, I think you said it was in Oslo, was was it the Inquisition, or it was the Church, whomever it was, that they'd written it down after they'd confiscated it from somebody as a practitioner, and that he had personally adapted it. So do you think today, like you mentioned before, there's a certain kind of staleness sometimes because they haven't been activated? Do you think modern folk could feel confident in adapting to a more modern context and adding their own modern language and flair to these conjurations to sort of bring them into our era?
Absolutely. And yeah, the book that I mentioned is from a Swedish trial record, and we have the trial record and the copy of it. So we have the book essentially, and it's been included in the big collection that was published by Revelor a few years ago, Svartkonstböcker, right? Black books, black art books in English translation, but it has a Swedish title, but it is in English. So you can find all of them there, the Swedish ones. So yes, adapt, absolutely. I mean, they can be translated, right? They have traveled and had an extraordinary longevity, these Cyprianic conjurations, because of translation. That's not an impediment. The Greek prayer of Saint Cyprian is not like the original. I mean, the scholarly speculation, which I think is probably along the right track, would claim that it's Coptic in origin, perhaps, right? So the language thing is not a big issue. So translate to your own language, for instance. So let's say you're interested in this, you buy the Hadean pamphlet of the Greek prayer, or the Scandinavian, Norwegian Cyprianic conjurations, and your first language is not English. Translate them, because they've already been translated. there's a long tradition of that. That's not a problem. So the adaptation to a contemporary setting that I would recommend would first of all be to think carefully about what spirits you are binding in the conjuration, right? So the Scandinavian one is a really good example of how someone has adapted this to the local type of spirit ecologies that you have. So you should know your spirit ecologies. You should know what type of spirit ecologies you understand the meaning of, right? And then have that in the list of things that you're binding. Now, most people who practice this sort of thing have a notion of what they're saying, even if the name of that spirit type is different, right? So we have a sort of spirit ecology, and we kind of palimpsest wise project on, so it's likely to work anyway. But that's something to bear in mind, because that was the classic adaptation that was done when Scandinavian practitioners adapted these prayers. They were like, oh, here's a list of things in Latin. We're going to translate it into equivalent spirit types from our spirit ecology, which they knew, right? So this is important to know. And that adaptation, I think one should make. Alternatively, of course, learn what the spirit ecology is in the thing that you're reading, and then have an idea of that and so on. But otherwise, you don't really have to do all that much really to adapt, because they're pretty straightforward, you know. The other thing that I guess is also worth saying about adaptation, if you look at the this isn't so much an issue with the Scandinavian Cyprianic conjurations, because it's Reformation, there are no saints, so you're not really conjuring by many. There are a few saints' names in some of them, because you can see that they've really been working with an original from the Latin or the version of the continent. But typically it's more about biblical characters from the Old Testament, for instance, a lot, and the aspects of the life of Jesus that you're swearing by, like by the blood of Jesus, by the this of Jesus, and so on, right? So Jesus is very central. But in the Greek one, you have a list of lots and lots of saints, right? Now, those saints are specific to a context. And here again, it's useful to, you can add saints that you have pacts with into that, right? So you could, I mean, obviously most people today, if they've done something like Jason Miller's kind of way of working with the Black School, you would have Saint Justina in there. You can add that to the saint list, and sort of make that saint list more specific to what you already have tapped into and have pacts with. So that those are the sort of the adaptations that I think are most useful for making it work. Yeah, and then also to think about framing rites. And one of the things that is actually, I guess, a little bit of the secret sauce to the Cyprianic conjurations, in at least its continental form, maybe not its Scandinavian form, is actually a Marian background to it. One of the manuscripts we have, not the one I translated for various reasons, didn't pick that one, but it has a version of this quite common protective prayer that is Jewish in origin, where you say, "There's an angel on my left and my right, and in the four
Ah,
corners."
like a lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram.
If you like. It came from somewhere, and or like the seven archangels around you, or however many, and then with Mary above you, it actually gives you a direction, so facing north, which I have in the pamphlet and so on. And so one thing that actually makes this more effective is as a framing rite to, as a minimum, um, uh, call on those angelic creatures and have Mary above you and in front of you, or rather of the client, if you've got like a live setting. That really helps, and that's mentioned in one of them as something that the conjurer is actively, picturing. So I think that adds a lot. And Mary is you can see that she's quite important as a source of power in the earlier versions. Now it becomes less so in the Scandinavian ones because of Lutheranism and so on. And Jesus is more central there, much more central actually. But that's something I would suggest. And so as I mentioned, the Coptic prayer of Mary as a framing rite, because it also has that same protective formula of like invoking the angels around you and so on. And yeah, so that's something you can do. and experiment with.
Mm. You briefly mentioned the North then during
Yes.
this. So really quick, this is something that I'm always really interested in hearing. What is the importance of the North in this specific practice?
Evil comes from the north. Yeah, I mean, evil comes from the north, right? So you want to face evil to drive away. I mean, sorry, you want to face evil to drive evil away. Because this is an exorcistic rite. You're throwing things away into the place, their place of origin. So that's why you face north. Um, I mean, another way that if you really want to have a kind of beginners, I was thinking just your earlier question, how can you begin to activate this Cyprianic conjuration? And if you already have a practice with Saint Cyprian, this becomes easier, right? Like all these things can be integrated. But the way in which it was developed in the Scandinavian tradition, there's one very simple way of activating, which I really like, which is that you take a little book. You could go all fancy and make it yourself or whatever, but you just have a small book that you can carry on your person. This is kind of important for how it's going to operate. And then you do what uh, is specified in the Scandinavian longer versions of this, which is that you, on a Sunday morning in the hour of the sun, or when the priest is giving a sermon, at that hour, you copy out the prayer of Saint Cyprian in one of its forms, and you fill in your own name where it says, NN. And at the end of it, you'll see that it says, whoever carries this text on them or has this book will be protected. And you read it out and you do this in the hour, right? And the book is then this living object that is also a phylactery in itself. So the difference between this and the much earlier versions that we have in the late medieval period and medieval period is that here it's not so much a scroll, a phylactery, a folded piece of paper, it's the book. The book itself is the phylactery. This is what happens in the Scandinavian traditions and becomes very important. So that's why the book was small and you could carry it here because it was supposed to be like a phylactery, right? So the book is itself its own little protection. That's, I think, has so much to do with why people thought this was powerful in itself. Because imagine you are the maid and you pick up your master's little Cyprianus and you read that first chunk of text and you perhaps don't really pay attention to the whole thing. You go to the end of it and you see whoever carries this, right? Like that is the sort of activation. And so that's a way of making your little book of spells that you carry with you with your kind of, your Swiss Army knife collection of things into also a phylactery. And I think that's a very simple way of using it to activate any little book that you carry with you so that it's more than just a collection of recipes.
Mm. Yeah, wow, that's fantastic advice. Thank you for sharing all of that. Very wonderful, wonderful stuff. I suppose drawing our interview to its end, do you have any books that you recommend for people on this subject? You've already mentioned Jason Miller's quite famous course on Saint Cyprian, but are there any other texts out there that you would recommend our listeners seek out?
Yeah, so I mean, there's so much, and I'm sure Hadean has published a lot of it, right? Leitau's work and so on. All the translations are really great that are already out there, and a lot of trade editions now. I would recommend a couple of articles really that are looking into if you're interested in the sort of the history of the book, because it'll show you the relationship between the prayer and the book, because those were initially confused. So that the true book of Saint Cyprian is simply the prayer of Saint Cyprian. So scholarship on the prayer I find really interesting. And gosh, I think, I have a bibliography in the in the pamphlet. I'm not saying you must go and get the pamphlet, but there's bibliography in the pamphlet and so on that will take you to those articles and resources. And yeah, I think that would be my recommendation really, to look at some of the articles that talk specifically about the prayer. Um, and then not to miss out on the Coptic material and see the connections there.
Yeah, I think I have a copy of that behind me. It's that massive chunky one, right?
Ancient Christian Magic, it's called.
Oh, I don't have that one specifically. No, I have a different one. There you go. I've got the Coptic magical papyri.
Yeah, absolutely. That one is better, right? I was just thinking if that's newer, and also the same part of the same team that put together this more recent scholarly edition also have an online edition which
Mm.
is free, which is called Cyprianus, right? It makes a reference to his importance in some of the magic. So I also encourage people to just access that for free because it's a really good edition as well, and you'll find a lot of complementary material if you're interested in going deeper with also a lot of the spirits, like the three children in the furnace and so on. I mean, there are a lot of spells there that you can see have made their way into um, the Cyprianic conjurations.
Excellent. Well, great advice and great book recommendations, and I will include all of those things in the description of the video at the end of the interview. Finally, for our audience that might want to learn more about you and your work, obviously you have your pamphlets and your book now coming through Hadean, but where else can our audience find you online? And do you have anything else that you're working on at the moment?
I have so many things that I'm working on at the moment. Yeah, three things I'm working on at the moment, which are a book on mysticism. I've just finished another book on mysticism, and I'm planning to do a project on the divine energies and their relationship to energy, humanities, and energetics. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, that's going to be in the works over the next couple of years. And then I'm working on quite a technical thing, which I'm excited about, which is about the French debate on contemplation at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, where mystical theology saw this kind of absolute flourishing of systematic technical vocabulary being developed about what happens in all the different stages of mysticism, broadly so called, and so that's a smaller thing I'm working on. And then my third project is one that I'm calling folklore theology, which may or may not turn into a book, but it's going to be a series of articles anyway. And that is growing out of partly what I've done for Hadean and some earlier stuff as well, where I'm thinking about writing a story of what's often just referred to as folklore in relation to the religion that again often was seen as kind of oppositional to the ecologies of spirits in the place, especially of Northern Europe. So I'm excited about that. But those are the three things. And if you want to follow my writing, I maintain a Substack called Techniques of Ecstasy, which is essentially like a journal of me reading for my research. It's kind of open notebook, as it were, on things. And I publish mostly at the moment on techniques in the Western Christian tradition because I find them so fascinating and under-researched. And a lot of that has obvious overlap with the practices that you find in the grimoires. Yeah.
Well, I'm definitely going to subscribe. It sounds right up my street. I love that sort of stuff. Simone, thank you so much for coming onto the show today and sharing all of this really interesting information about Cyprian in Scandinavia. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
That was Simone Kotva, author of Cyprianus, Saint Cyprian and the Black Book in Scandinavian Folklore, available now from Hadean Press. It was genuinely wonderful talking to Simone about her experiences with this book, both material and immaterial, translating oral records from the work of Christensen to present them to a modern English-speaking audience. Simone has an exceptionally sharp and cunning mind when it comes to working such sorcery, and I was equally as happy to learn about her experiences with a variety of grimoires that we share passions for. During our conversation, there were a number of points that Simone made which I absolutely adored, one of which was how the Book of Cyprian is an aggressively animistic object, and how intentionality and initiation play a strong role within an enchanted world. I really enjoyed her take on the Liber Spiritum, the nature of pacts in the Scandinavian tradition, and how the legends which move around the Cyprianus derive from the same storehouse of practices and thought worlds associated with Norse spirit ecology. The book itself is a great introduction to folk magic in general, with its Northern European flavoured street wisdom and quick-witted cunning. While it doesn't specifically focus on historiola as a theme, I think people who are interested in the technique, and indeed with cunning techniques in general, will be greatly rewarded by spending time thinking on Simone's work. If you have listened this far, then thank you so much for your continued support for Hadean Press and our global authorship. I am so happy that we have made it to 3 years. Here's to many more in the future. If you have any suggestions for authors that you would like to see on the podcast, please leave a message below, and as always, please like, share, and subscribe for more like this in the future. Thank you all so much for listening. I have been your host, Matt Hadfield, and I will see you all again in the next one.